Well, one of the things that I really enjoy doing in my preaching is talking about various Bible characters. And I know that you know that there are major Bible characters that we read a lot about, and there are minor characters that appear on the stage of Bible history briefly and then they're gone. I especially like to preach sermons about the minor characters that we read about in the Bible, and I want to do that this morning. This particular individual is named only 11 times in 10 verses in the New Testament. And really all that we know about this individual is found in 4 parallel passages in the Gospels and 1 verse in the book of Acts. So we don't really know very much about this person. In fact, before I put this sermon together, really several years ago now, I hesitated for a long time. I thought, well, there has to be a sermon, but I just wasn't sure if there would be. But I decided to sit down and see what I could put together. I thought to myself, well, it might work out to be a short sermon, and if that happens, then everybody's going to be surprised and everybody's going to be happy. And, well, it didn't turn out to be such a short sermon, and you're not surprised about that, but the individual that I'm talking about was profoundly affected by Jesus. And yet there is no evidence that this person ever came into contact with Jesus. No evidence that this individual ever saw Jesus, even from a distance, or met him, or heard him preach and teach, or witnessed one of his miracles. Of course, as popular and as well known as Jesus was in first century Palestine, it's possible that any one of those things might have happened, but if so, there is no record of that. Do you know who I'm talking about? I've tried to give you some hints, and yet not too many hints. Are we having trouble with the PowerPoint? Okay. Well, I found out that we had trouble with the 9 o'clock hour, and I was just preaching away and didn't know that. And so we're going to have some consultation with our technical people and see if we can get some things worked out. The individual that I'm talking about is Barabbas. Let me ask you, have you ever heard a sermon about Barabbas? Dee's shaking her head no. I preached this sermon in Vermont when we were on vacation 2.5 months ago, and the brethren there reacted the same way Dee did. They were shaking their head no. I don't ever remember hearing a sermon about this particular Bible character when I was growing up. Now, it may have happened and I just don't remember, but really I kind of doubt that I did. I did find a couple of audio recordings of sermons about this Bible character, I think by David McClister and Ralph Walker, if I'm remembering correctly, and I listened to those sermons and they were helpful, and I kind of borrowed some of that material and put it together in this sermon. I really tried to kind of throw you a curveball when I said that there's no evidence that this individual had ever met Jesus or seen him or heard him teach or preach. And you may be thinking, well, Barabbas must have at least seen Jesus when both of them were presented to the Jewish mob. But let me point out that the gospel writers do not say that. They do not say that both Jesus and Barabbas were presented at the same time, or that Barabbas was presented at all. He is certainly referred to, but there's no indication that he was trotted out before that Jewish crowd. Maybe that's what happened. That's the way it's presented in the 1961 Hollywood movie entitled Barabbas. I don't know if any of you remember that movie. I probably saw it on a black and white TV when I was just a lad. I don't know if I've seen it more than once. That's the way the movie depicts the scene. But that's not what the gospel writers tell us. I want to talk with you about what we know about Barabbas, and then what happened to him, and then what we can learn from him. And so first of all, what do we know about Barabbas? And I'm going to read 6 passages from the New Testament that really tell us all that we know about this individual. Matthew tells us in Matthew 27, verse 16, and at that time they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Mark says in Mark 15, verse 7, and there was one named Barabbas who was chained with his fellow rebels. They had committed murder in the rebellion. Luke writes in Luke 23 and verse 19, speaking of Barabbas, he says, who had been thrown into prison for a certain rebellion made in the city and for murder. And then in verse 25, Luke says, and he, Pilate, released to them the one they requested, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison, but he delivered Jesus to their will. And then John tells us in John 18 and verse 40, then they all cried again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber. And then Peter told a Jewish audience in Acts chapter 3 and verse 14, but you denied the Holy One and the just and asked for a murderer to be granted to you. Those 6 passages tell us all that we know about Barabbas. But let me summarize what these verses tell us. They tell us, first of all, that his name was Barabbas, which means son of a father or son of the father. Bar means son of, as you well know. But in my study for this sermon, I found something interesting, that in some of the Greek manuscripts, Pilate offers the crowd a choice between Jesus Messiah or Jesus Christ and Jesus, Son of the Father, Jesus Barabbas. I didn't know that before I put this sermon together. If those manuscripts are correct, it's very interesting to me that Pilate gave them the choice between Jesus Barabbas on the one hand and Jesus Christ on the other. The gospel writers tell us that this man was a prisoner. Now, we don't know when or where or how, but we do know that Barabbas had been captured and thrown into prison. But the gospel writers tell us even more than that. They tell us that he was a notorious prisoner. So Barabbas was not just your average run-of-the-mill bad guy. He was a notorious individual who was well-known and infamous. He would have been a prisoner like John Dillinger or Al Capone in more modern times. And Mark tells us that he was chained. Luke tells us in Acts chapter 12 and verse 6 that Peter, the Apostle Peter, was chained between two soldiers, which I suppose would indicate what we might call maximum security. We're just told that Barabbas was chained along with other prisoners, so we don't really know if he was experiencing something that we could call maximum security or not. We are also told that he was a rebel along with other fellow rebels. So Barabbas was an insurrectionist like John Brown in the days of the Civil War, or Timothy McVeigh, or Osama bin Laden. And he was not working alone to drive the Romans out of Palestine. He was working along with other insurrectionists. And the gospel writers tell us that he had participated in the rebellion, or a certain rebellion. Now, we don't know which rebellion that was. There were dozens in Palestine in the first century, but it is worth noting that this rebellion is described as the rebellion. In other words, this insurrection was well known when Mark and Luke wrote their Gospels. This was not some obscure kind of thing. And Luke tells us that this rebellion took place in the city of Jerusalem. And so this rebellion that Barabbas had participated in was not something that had occurred way up north in Galilee or out in the desert of Judea. It had taken place right there in the city of Jerusalem. And that means that Barabbas and his deeds would have been well known to the Jews in that city. John tells us that he was a robber. And those who have studied the original language tell us that this term can mean a couple of different things. It can refer to a robber, a highwayman, a bandit, or it can refer to a revolutionary or an insurrectionist, a guerrilla. In fact, some of our English translations render the term that way. Some read revolutionary. The NIV says that he had taken part in an uprising. The NRSV describes him as a bandit. And then finally, the gospel writers tell us that he was a murderer. Now, please note that he was not just arrested and charged with murder, he was guilty of murder. We all understand that people can be arrested and charged with murder when in fact they're innocent, but that's not the case with this man, and we know that because the inspired apostle Peter says in Acts 3 verse 14, "But you denied the Holy One and the just and asked for a murderer to be granted to you." And so we're talking about a man who was guilty as charged. That's what we know about him. We also know what happened to him. We know that Pilate offered that Jewish crowd to release either Barabbas or Jesus. Matthew says in Matthew 27 verse 17, "Therefore, when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" We are also told that the Jewish leaders, the chief priests and the elders, had persuaded the multitude to ask for Barabbas. Evidently, this was not something that the multitude came up with on their own. They were encouraged, they were stirred up to ask for the release of Barabbas. Matthew says in Matthew 27:20, "But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus." And John tells us in John 18 verse 40 that they demanded the release of Barabbas. And of course we know that Pilate released it. Mark tells us in Mark 15 verse 15, "So Pilate, wanting to gratify the crowd, released Barabbas to them, and he delivered Jesus after he had scourged him to be crucified." Well, that's what we know. That's what happened to Barabbas. What can we learn? What can we learn from the story of this man who just appears briefly on the stage of Bible history? Well, when you stop and you think about it, there are several things that we can learn. The first thing that I want to mention is we learn from his story that life isn't always fair. Now, I realize that to this audience, that's no great revelation. You don't have to live all that long before you realize that things in life just don't always turn out the way they should. But without doubt, the release of Barabbas and the condemnation of Jesus was the greatest inequity that our world has ever known, because Barabbas and Jesus were as different as night and day. For example, Barabbas was just a man. Jesus was Emmanuel, God with us. As I've already mentioned, Barabbas was the son of a father. Jesus is the only begotten Son of God. And Barabbas was a notorious prisoner, but Jesus is the one who sets sinners free. Barabbas was chained, but Jesus brings liberty. Barabbas was a rebel, but Jesus was completely obedient and submissive to his Father's will. Barabbas was a murderer, but Jesus gives life and gives it abundantly. Barabbas was a robber, but Jesus provides and sustains. In other words, Barabbas was a taker, Jesus was a giver. Barabbas was selfish, Jesus was completely selfless. Barabbas went about doing bad things. We're told by Peter in Acts 10 verse 38 that Jesus went about doing good. And as I've already mentioned, Barabbas was egregiously guilty, and Jesus was completely innocent. They were as different as night and day. So what was done in the name of justice was nothing but the height of injustice. As I've already mentioned, it doesn't take you all that long to realize, if you're paying attention, that life isn't always fair, but it can be a hard lesson for us to learn. Because life should be fair. And human tribunals should be just. Moses told his people in Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 15, "You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor." That's the way it's supposed to work. But life isn't always fair, and human tribunals aren't always just. And that's just one of the sad realities of life. The good guys don't always win here. My mother, when she was a young girl, went to see a James Cagney movie entitled 13 Rue Madeleine. You remember, Mama? And she was devastated by the ending of that movie. Because James Cagney was caught by the Germans behind German lines, and they were torturing him to obtain information that they desperately wanted. And I'll not say more about the ending. Mark, it's a good movie. You ought to check it out. It's black and white. I mean, it's an old movie. Mark thinks old movies are like the 60s. I go back to the 30s and the 40s. So I'll not tell you the ending of the movie, but let me just say it doesn't work out well for Bob Sharkey, the character that Cagney plays. I remember my mom telling me how devastating it was when she saw that movie, because for the first time in her life, maybe she realized the good guys don't always win here. The Bible clearly teaches that sometimes wicked people prosper and righteous people suffer. We learned that in our study of Ecclesiastes. Solomon says in Ecclesiastes 9:11, "I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all." Recognizing that life is not always fair is one of the hardest lessons that we need to learn. It's a lesson that we struggle with. It was something that the prophet Jeremiah struggled with. He said in Jeremiah chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, "Righteous are you, O Lord, when I plead with you, yet let me talk with you about your judgments." And then he asked the question, why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why are those happy who deal so treacherously? You have planted them. Yes, they have taken root. They grow. Yes, they bear fruit. You are near in their mouth, but far from their mind. And Jeremiah just couldn't wrap his brain around that. But folks, what's even harder for us and more important is learning to react and respond to the inequities of life in the right way. And how we do that is vitally important. Let me remind you that Jesus could have destroyed all of his enemies with just a word or a wave of his hand. We sing the song, he could have called 10,000 angels, but the gospel writers tell us that he could have called 12 legion of angels, 72,000 of them. Instead, Jesus submitted to the cross with all of its indignity and shame, with all of its suffering and pain, to accomplish the Father's will. Peter writes in 1 Peter 2, beginning in verse 21, "For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth, who when he was reviled did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously. When we are cruelly and unjustly treated, it is very tempting for us to respond in the wrong way. For example, we are tempted to strike back. In other words, we are tempted to respond in kind, to treat others the way they have treated us. But that's the wrong way to respond. The wise man says in Proverbs 24, verse 29, "Do not say, I will do to him just as he has done to me. I will render to the man according to his work." The wise man says that's not the way you should live your life. But then there's a second response, and that is that we draw back. We isolate ourselves from the person who has mistreated us. We don't strike back. We draw back. We just do nothing. And we often pat ourselves on the back saying, "Oh, what a good boy am I," because we didn't strike back. We didn't mistreat the one who has mistreated us. But Jesus calls us to a higher plane. Jesus tells us through the pen of the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 12 and verse 14 that we should bless those who persecute us and bless and do not curse. Paul says in verse 17, "Repay no one evil for evil." In verse 19 he says, "Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord.'" In verse 21, Paul says, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." And that's what Jesus practiced. Jesus practiced what he preached. A second lesson that we learn from Barabbas' story is that religion without knowledge is dangerous. Religion without knowledge, religion without true faith, religion that is not based on true commitment to God, religion that lacks the courage to carry that commitment out, that kind of religion is a dangerous thing. You see, that's the kind of religion that the Jews had. How could these people have ever picked Barabbas over Jesus? We would not have paroled Charles Manson while he was still alive. One of the really scary things about this story is that it was religious people who asked for Barabbas' release and demanded the crucifixion of Jesus. And history tells us that repeatedly down throughout the ages, religious people have committed some of the worst sins in the name of religion. What about the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, the witch trials in Salem, and we could just go on and on. Why did these people choose Barabbas and reject Jesus? It is because they were not properly guided by the Word of God. Self-interest was more important to them than God's plan, and their traditions became more important than a "thus saith the Lord." It wasn't that they didn't have the ability to understand, they didn't want to listen to God. And a lot of religious people are like that today. You see, if these Jews had understood the Old Testament Scriptures, they should have recognized Jesus as the Messiah. Because the Messiah was to be a king. So why would they object to Jesus' claims of kingship? God says through Ezekiel's pen in Ezekiel 37 verse 24, David my servant shall be king over them, and they shall all have one shepherd. They shall also walk in my judgments and observe my statutes and do them. And so the prophets had told Israel that their Messiah would be a king. In addition to that, Jesus did the kind of things that the prophets said the Messiah would do. When John the Baptist was in prison, he sent a couple of his disciples to ask Jesus, are you the coming one? Are you really the guy? Or should we be looking for someone else? And Jesus responded by saying, go and tell John the things which you hear and see. The blind see and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he who is not offended because of me. And the Old Testament prophets had said that the Messiah would do all of those things. I can give you an Old Testament passage for every item that Jesus mentions except lepers are cleansed. You see, religious zeal becomes a blinding force when it is not accompanied by truth and a willingness to follow the truth wherever it leads. Paul said of his Jewish countrymen in Romans chapter 10 that they had a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. Lesson number 3, religious people should not blindly follow religious leaders. Now, I know that you know that. But that is one of the lessons that we can learn from this story. That Jewish mob cried out, let him be crucified, let him be crucified, because they were persuaded to do that by their respected religious leaders. And today, many people blindly follow their religious leaders, and they do whatever the leaders tell them to do. And I can illustrate that point by merely mentioning the names of Jim Jones, David Koresh, Joseph Smith, the Pope, the priest, even sometimes the elders in a local church, and the preacher. But religious people can be wrong. Religious leaders can be wrong. 2 Samuel 7, when David wanted to build the temple for the Lord, he talked to Nathan, the prophet, about that. Nathan thought it was a great idea, said, go ahead, the Lord's with you. And that night, the Lord appeared to Nathan in a dream, telling him basically, when did I ever say anything about this? If our religious leaders are wrong and we blindly follow them, what's going to happen? What did Jesus say? When the blind lead the blind, what happens? They both fall into the ditch. Religious people must learn to think for themselves and follow religious leaders only as they follow Christ. Years ago, when I was preaching in Bowling Green, Kentucky, I preached a sermon and I presented two opposing viewpoints. I don't even now remember what the subject was, and arguments pro and con for both views, and I left it at that. And at the end of the service, one of the good ladies in the congregation came out. She shook my hand and she said to me, Kevin, I just wish you'd tell us what we're supposed to believe. And I've never forgotten those words. That's what a lot of Christians want you to do. You just tell us and we'll just do it. But religious leaders can be wrong. I've been wrong. I've changed my mind about some things. Lesson number 4, hypocrites are often blind to their hypocrisy. In demanding the release of Barabbas and the crucifixion of Jesus, they were releasing a man who was guilty of one of the very charges that they had leveled against Jesus, insurrection. Barabbas was guilty of that. That's what they said Jesus was guilty of. But of course we know that Jesus wouldn't harm a fly. He wouldn't break a bruised reed, we're told. You see, the really scary thing about hypocrisy is that hypocrites don't recognize it. I appreciate an observation that Kenneth Chumley makes in his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. He says, when Jesus called the scribes and Pharisees hypocrites, he didn't mean they were merely play acting, pretending, that is, men inwardly aware of their badness, but posing as good men. The trouble with them was that they sincerely thought they were good men who were championing the cause of true religion, while all the time they failed to see that their goodness was largely counterfeit as well as lamentably deficient. That's the dangerous thing about hypocrisy. We don't recognize it. We all need to ask ourselves the question, could I be a hypocrite and not know it? Lesson number 5, mobs encourage wickedness. As a part of a mob, people will do things that they would never do on their own. May I remind you of the looting in the St. Louis suburb of Ferguson, Missouri, back in 2014. We need to be aware of the danger of mob psychology. The law of Moses said in Exodus 23:2, you shall not follow a crowd to do evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after many to pervert justice. Lesson number 6, every sinner outside of Christ is like Barabbas. As sinners, we have become sons of our father, the devil. John tells us in 1 John 3, verse 8, he who sins is of the devil, for the devil has sinned from the beginning. As sinners, we have been enslaved and imprisoned by sin. Jesus tells us in John 8, verse 34, most assuredly I say to you, whoever commits sin is a slave of sin, and a slave does not abide in the house forever, but a son abides forever. As sinners, we were rebels against God. Oh, yes, we were. Yes, I was. Yes, you were. In the Song of the Suffering Servant, Isaiah says in Isaiah 53, verse 6, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And those outside of Christ have robbed God of the pure, innocent soul that they once were. And as sinners, they are egregiously guilty. Peter writes in 1 Peter 3 and verse 18, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust." And then finally, every Christian, washed clean by the blood of Jesus is Barabbas. Barabbas, a guilty man, was released, and Jesus, an innocent man, was punished instead in his place. I see typological significance in the release of Barabbas and the condemnation of Jesus that I believe points to the truth of penal substitution. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 21, "For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him." Now that does not mean that Jesus became a sinner. It does not mean that Jesus became guilty. I believe it means that Jesus was treated as though he were a sinner and punished as a sinner in the place of sinners. And that means I am Barabbas. And you are too. Well, I suppose that we would like to know how this story ends. What happened after Barabbas was released? Well, the New Testament doesn't tell us. I can envision 4 different possible scenarios. Ending number 1, he may have just continued to be and do what he'd always done. That's what a large percentage of criminals do today when they are released from prison. They just go back and do the same things they were doing before. They don't learn anything. They don't change. They don't get any better. They often get worse. Ending number 2, it could be that Barabbas became a better man, even a good man, but not a Christian. Ending number 3, he became a Christian, but sooner or later became unfaithful to the Lord. And then, of course, ending number 4 is that he became a Christian and remained faithful till he died. That's the way the 1961 movie portrays it. Barabbas becomes a follower of Jesus in the movie. The Gospels don't tell us that. That's what I would wish for. That's the way I hope the story went for Barabbas, but we're not told. But it occurs to me that these 4 possible endings for Barabbas' story are the 4 possible endings for our own. It may be that a person for whom Jesus died just keeps on doing what he's always done. Ending number 2, influenced by the story of Jesus, he might become a better person, even a good person, but he never makes the decision to become a Christian. But of course that can't be a happy ending. Ending number 3, he becomes a Christian but eventually falls away. So many Christians do that. Have you noticed that? And then, of course, ending number 4. We make the decision to follow Jesus. We become a Christian, and we learn and grow and mature in the faith, and we remain faithful to Jesus until we die. That's the only ending that's a happy ending. And so my question for you this morning is this: where are you in this story? How will your story end? Really, it's up to you. If you've not made the decision to become a Christian, to follow Jesus, may I urge you to make that decision and to do that this morning. If you're a Christian but you've not been living as you should live as a Christian, you're not as dedicated and devoted and diligent as you should be, may I urge you to change, to do better, to seek God's forgiveness through repentance and prayer. If you need to do that, you can do that right now as we stand and we sing.